Now that you've learned the basics of how to research your Extemp, it's now time to learn how to organize an Extemp speech and create an outline. Fortunately, the structure of an Extemp outline is very straightforward. If you've watched multiple Extemp speeches, then you've noticed that almost every single one follows the exact same structure. A humorous intro that leads to the question, followed by an answer with 3 subpoints and then 3 body paragraphs with a very brief conclusion at the end. The structure of an Extemp speech has to be straightforward given the fact that you only have 30 minutes to prepare for your speech. So let's take a closer look at each of the components and then go through an example together. First is the introduction. The intro always starts with a hook, and the hook can be many things. It can be a proverb, it could be a quotation, it could be an anecdote, it could be a story. The key point though is that it has to be something humorous. Often it's a political joke. And it's really important to do that because otherwise you'll be boring your audience to tears. Extemp questions are often very cut and dry about serious contemporary events, and so if you just start off on a very serious note, you're going to bore your audience. And from that hook, you will then transition to the main topic of your speech. Now, with the transition, it's important that when you transition from your opening hook to your topic, that you do not have a giant leap that leaves your audience wondering how you got from point A to point B. You need to build a logical and coherent bridge between your humorous opening hook and the topic at hand. So you couldn't just open up with a non sequitur knock-knock joke and then start talking about China if your knock-knock joke had nothing to do about that topic. One of the biggest mistakes I see with beginner extempers is that the transition between the hook and the topic is far too abrupt and underdeveloped, which makes your hook feel very cheesy and forced. If you can show that your hook and your opening joke actually relates directly to your topic, it makes you look very professional. After the transition, you'll oftentimes want to work to get to the question. And that transition requires you to have necessary background information that sets the context for the question before you state that question to the judge. Oftentimes, the questions, right, have a lot of baggage with them. If we're talking about what's going on in the 2020 Democratic election and whether Joe Biden will remain the front runner, well, guess what? You're going to have to give some background on what's been going on in that election, namely noting that it's such a crowded field with so much uncertainty going on there. And then you'll finally state the question. And that's almost always, if you've noticed, there's a signal phrase that says, which leads us to today's question. And then you will recite that question verbatim. And finally, the last bit of the introduction is your thesis. And your thesis statement always answers the question with 3 subpoints. And there are some important notes I want to talk about with the subpoints because these are almost always the biggest structural issues I see with freshman Extemp speeches. Just one definitional note, I'm going to call the answer to your question your core thesis, so not the subpoints, but that thing that comes before the subpoints, either a yes or a no or quantifying some aspect of the question. I'm going to call that the controlling idea. Why? Because everything in your speech should be working to prove your controlling idea. It's just like the English essays that you'll be writing here. All of your subpoints then need to support your controlling idea. In fact, everything that comes out for the rest of the speech in an Extemp is filtered through the lens of how well you are supporting and proving your controlling idea, the thesis to your question. So let me give you an example of this controlling idea plus subpoint format. Let's say your Extemp question was, what is the best food ever? So obviously that wouldn't be an Extemp question, I'm just giving a humorous example. Here's what a CI and subpoint might look like. You might say, the answer to today's question is pizza is the best food ever for 3 reasons. First, it's cheap. Second, it tastes delicious. And third, it has tons of options. Notice that all of those subpoints provide clear reasons why pizza is the best food ever, so they set you up well to prove your controlling idea. Now, here are my key points about your subpoints. First, you need to make sure that you are diversifying your subpoints. They need to be distinct from each other. Oftentimes, I see freshmen have overlapping subpoints, and what I mean by that is that functionally, 2 of your subpoints are basically the same thing. So if you were talking about pizza having tons of options, and then there being a variety of many different types of pizzas, well, guess what? Both of those subpoints are functionally saying the same thing, variety. So those are overlapping subpoints. Another example of this would be if you said pizza is the best food ever because it's cheap, it tastes delicious, and its ingredients work well together. Notice how the second and third subpoints, that it tastes delicious and its ingredients work well together, get at the same idea, that it tastes good. That will make those 2 paragraphs redundant. So that's the first thing you got to watch out for. The second thing is to make sure your subpoints are fully developed ideas as opposed to just one-word nouns. Oftentimes, extempers just toss one-word subpoints out and it's not clear what it means. So for instance, in response to the question, can the conflict between Israel and Palestine be resolved peacefully? I once saw a speaker say no because 1, violence, 2, territory, and 3, Israel. Notice how it's hard to tell really what those subpoints mean. When the speaker says violence, does he mean violence perpetuated by one side or by both sides? Who's the actor of that violence? Is it Israel? Is it Palestine? Etc. When he says territory, the same question applies. What territory is he talking about? Who owns it? And how does it apply to this speech? And finally, the third subpoint was vaguest of all. He just said Israel. Israel is literally one of the 2 countries listed in the question. How does that help to prove the controlling idea? So that's a not so great example. Let's look at a better one. From the 2018 national champion speech, her question was, how will the Trump administration affect America's long-term influence in international affairs? And her controlling idea was that Trump will diminish our long-term influence with his isolationism. So that's a strong controlling idea. That's a strong thesis. Now here were her 3 subpoints about how Trump will diminish our long-term influence. First, by letting China take the lead on free trade. Second, by withdrawing from the Iranian nuclear deal. And third, by encouraging Russian encroachment in Eastern Europe. Notice how those are fully fleshed out ideas. She didn't just say, Trump will diminish our long-term influence for 3 reasons. First, China. Second, Iran. And third, Russia. Notice how if you were to phrase it like that, it would be very vague and unclear what you mean there. So it's important, I think, to flesh out your subpoints and make it clear exactly what you're saying. Now, you want to make sure not to have super long phrases that turn your thesis statement into a 5-line sentence. That would be ridiculous. You want to keep it brief, but you want it to be fleshed out enough. Now, the reason I'm spending so long talking about subpoints is because if you develop weak subpoints, it's really hard to have a strong extemp speech. The CI and the subpoints are the skeleton, the foundation upon which the rest of your speech is built. And you don't want faulty or weak foundations. Now, here's how to develop your controlling idea and subpoint. The controlling idea should be fairly easy. From your research about your question, you should be able to determine what answer to that question seems most appropriate. Oftentimes, Extemp is asking yes/no questions, right? Or it's asking about very specific answers, like who will be the front runner in the Democratic primary, or will Trump be able to pass X piece of legislation, or what is going to happen, etc. So regardless, it's oftentimes pretty straightforward what the answer should be. That said, your subpoints are where things get really important, because if you just give a generic and vague answer to that thesis, it's going to be a boring speech. So for subpoints, the way to develop them is you want to create categories based on your evidence. So if your question is about whether gun control legislation will be passed by the government, perhaps you see a grouping of evidence that talks about public pressure on politicians. Then you might see another grouping of evidence that talks about lobbies within government like the NRA. Those are the types of groupings you're looking for, right? You want to create those categories and begin grouping evidence under them and thinking about how that evidence will help to prove your overall controlling idea. Once you create those categories based on your evidence, then it's just a question of thinking of how to articulate and phrase your subpoint such that it helps to prove the controlling idea. So that's the thesis, the controlling idea plus your 3 subpoints. Now let's jump into the body paragraphs. Each paragraph, as I'm sure you've noticed, focuses on one of your subpoints. And I know this seems very intuitive and obvious, but you should keep your body paragraphs in the exact same order that you list your subpoints in the thesis statement. It'd be confusing if you changed the order of your body paragraphs from the order that you listed the subpoints in the thesis. So, at the beginning of your body paragraph, you need to do 2 things. First, you need to have some sort of external transition. And the most bare bones version of that would be quickly summarizing what you said in your last paragraph and then transitioning to the new paragraph, right? So if you're saying pizza is the most delicious food ever because of its cost, or because it's cheap, because it tastes delicious, etc., and you were transitioning from one subpoint to the other, you would say, in addition to pizza being very cheap, it also tastes incredibly delicious, which is the second reason why pizza is the best food ever. That's the most bare bones version of an external transition. Now, in 2019, people have gotten a lot more creative, and what you've probably noticed in these finalist speakers is that they actually oftentimes open up their paragraphs, their body paragraphs, with jokes. It's almost like they do another mini version of a hook. They'll insert a political joke, get some laughs, and then transition. If you remember from the 2018 national champion speech, in one of her points, she made a joke about the Iranian president and President Trump not quite being the same height. And so the Iranian president should probably wear heels because right now they're not seeing eye to eye. That's a funny external transition that's going to get to the heart of what that point's about, which is about disagreements between the US and Iran. Now, important note there is if you do that joke-style external transition, you need to make sure that the joke actually is applicable or topical to what you're going to be discussing in that paragraph. Regardless, after you do that external transition, and it really shouldn't be too long, then you need to have a topic sentence that explains what your second subpoint is and its relationship to the controlling idea. And that oftentimes is as simple as, which brings me to the second reason why pizza is the best food ever, because it tastes delicious. Once you do that topic sentence and you restate what your subpoint and your controlling idea is, then it's time to get into the meat. And this is where you start to have citations and evidence within your body paragraphs. You need at least 2 citations per paragraph from credible news sources that support your point. Now, the most important thing about evidence, though, is that it's not just there to agree with your thesis. It's actually there to help you develop warrants. And warrants are really important in debate. Warrants are not the thing that police officers show you when they knock on your door and say, hey, now we have the right to search your house. No, warrants when it comes to extemp and debate are all about reasons and justifications. That's what a warrant is, right? You have your claim, which is your overall argument. That's your thesis. You have evidence, which will provide concrete examples or expert analysis. And you use that evidence to develop warrants that support your claims, right? Which are reasons and justifications that help to explain why your evidence or your subpoint helps to prove your controlling idea. The more analysis you do to explain why your evidence helps to prove your controlling idea, the better off you will be. That's another huge mistake I see with novice extempers. They oftentimes start citing evidence and explaining facts without ever trying to tie it back to their thesis. If you aren't ultimately explaining to me why your answer to the extemp question is correct, then you aren't doing what you need to do. So for instance, last year I saw a speech about whether or not the international community should raise sanctions against North Korea. And the speaker had a whole subpoint about North Korea's most recent missile tests. And the subpoint wasn't bad. He was doing a lot of explanation of the history of North Korea's missile programs, what North Korea has been doing in the last couple months testing weapons, but he never once explained why those missile tests mean that the international community should raise sanctions. He never connected the dots there, and that's bad. Your entire purpose in an extemp speech is to prove your thesis. So if you aren't doing that, it's going to be an issue. After you finish a paragraph, right, after you establish multiple pieces of evidence, have strong explanation of what's going on there in a very concrete way and why that subpoint proves your controlling idea, then you'll move on to the next body paragraph. And each body paragraph follows the exact same format of starting with an external transition, hopefully having a joke there, then having a topic sentence that states your subpoint plus the controlling idea, and then moving into analysis of evidence and citations and establishing warrants that help to prove your controlling idea. And in a minute, we're going to look at an example outline. But I want you to know that the structure of an extemp speech is purposefully straightforward. It'd be very hard to have to reinvent the wheel every time you give an extemp speech, given the fact that you only have 30 minutes to prepare them. So hopefully this structure and organization should become very intuitive very quickly. After you do it once or twice, it should be like riding a bike. You'll never lose the hang of it. The way you end this speech finally is with the conclusion, and the conclusions are often as short as just summarizing your 3 points succinctly and then restating the thesis. But ideally, you have a sentence or two after that where you return to the opening hook as a way of providing rhetorical unity to the speech. It's very nice for an audience, and it makes you look very clever if you tie your thesis back, you tie your speech back around to the way that you opened it up. It just provides nice unity. So, now we're ready to look at a varsity member's outline. And this is Anuj Kathari, who's our extemp president, and he was a semifinalist at nationals last year. And so this was one of the speeches he gave. Now, this outline is way more detailed than anything you should be writing in round. Like, way, way, way more detailed. I had him type this out in a very extensive way afterwards, just for the purpose of this class. But at the end, I will show you what he actually wrote on the piece of paper, which is much shorter. But for our purposes, just to understand kind of what's going on here, let's take a look at his speech. So you can see, with his intro, he has a funny opening. He says, last year, Russian President Vladimir Putin was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by one of his foreign ministers. And I know this must be a shock for everyone, because how could a brutal authoritarian leader possibly have the opportunity of earning such an honor? However, I must admit, Vladimir Putin is a man of peace. He wants a piece of Estonia, a piece of Latvia, and a piece of practically every other Baltic nation he can get his hands on. So notice, the joke there is about subverting your expectations. It's about playing on the double meaning of the word peace, or I guess what it sounds like, even though they're different words in reality. When he says Putin is a man of peace, he doesn't mean peace as in like a lack of conflict and war. He means taking pieces of everything. So the second good thing about this joke is not only is it funny and helps to establish some of your personality, but it also relates directly to the Extemp speech on hand, or to the question, which is how serious a risk does Russian aggression pose to the Baltic states? So that's really important. You want to make sure your joke relates to the question, like I said before. Second, look at the way that he establishes the background there. He winds back the clock to 2014, explains the invasion of the Crimean Peninsula, and then explains that that diplomatic talks are failing and UN sanctions are doing little to stop Russia's advances. And so given that context, that helps the audience to understand why the question's important. And that's often what you're doing in the background, helping the audience to understand why the question is even relevant. And then he has his thesis. And he didn't put his subpoints in the thesis, but he obviously would have stated it within the speech itself. You can see here he says Russian aggression poses an incredibly serious risk because it unconditionally threatens Baltic sovereignty. So that's a strong controlling idea, right? And then he has three good subpoints here. The first one about Russia's rapidly expanding naval fleet, the second one about splintering within NATO, and the third about Russia's budding alliance system, or budding alliance with Turkey, I should say. So these are all good subpoints, and we're not going to go through each of them. I just want to go through one in great depth so that you understand the idea, and in your own time, please go through this outline in greater depth. So notice the way he's organized his subpoint. It's basically under his citations, and here he has three. And it's clear that from each of these sources, they're establishing different points. You want to make sure that each source is working to establish a unique and distinct warrant to help to prove your controlling idea. So let's look at the first one, right? He's saying Russian aggression poses a serious risk to Baltic sovereignty. And first, because of, as seen through Russia's expanding naval fleet. And so his first piece of evidence from naval interest argues that Russia's northern fleet is expanding dramatically because of all these new fighters that they've put into their fleet. And so he has some details here about how Russia's recent round of military drills comes just 1 month before a scheduled military exercise led by Great Britain. I'm sure he would expand in greater depth about exactly what these fighters are used for and how that means that Russia is really expanding militarily. And then significantly, notice this last line down here. This is one of the most key ones. He argues that Russia's willingness to defy the international community's orders to halt naval building signals their military belligerence and a possibility of confrontation. Boom. That last sentence is the key sentence that ties this back to the thesis, right? Because it's about how serious a risk does Russian aggression pose. And in that subpoint there, he makes it very clear that Russia is willing to defy the international community and thus be confrontational, which makes them a serious risk. A bad version of this would be if he just talked about Russia expanding their naval fleet. Now that may or may not be a bad thing, right? He needs to prove that the naval fleet expansion shows that Russia is willing to defy international norms and thus shows that they have a willingness to be aggressive. Next, his next piece of evidence from CNBC articulates what Russia did recently, which was seizing multiple Ukrainian ships in the strategic area of the Kerch Strait. Now that's significant, right? That subpoint speaks speaks on its own very directly. Clearly, if Russia is willing to start seizing ships in the Baltic area, that shows that they have a tendency to gain regional dominance. And again, he explains that well in this subpoint below in his analysis. And finally, his last citation from USNI News argues that Baltic nations need to increase defense spending and modernize their naval fleets to compete with Russia. But he's arguing that the current problem is that there's a lack of collaboration and there's an inability to share funding and create naval fleets, which means that these individual states are very, very weak and vulnerable in the face of Russian aggression. So a very nuanced point which addresses lots of different issues. It shows that Russia's military is expanding, which means that they're willing to defy international norms. They have already been seizing ships in that area, which shows that they're already posing a serious risk. And it argues that the Baltic nations are functionally powerless against Russian aggression because they do not have the ability to pool together their resources right now. So all of that is a very strong subpoint, and this is kind of the gold standard, what you're reaching towards in terms of the types of analysis that you want. It goes beyond just very surface level analysis and actually develops deep warrants here that help to prove the controlling idea. And you can see the other two subpoints do that as well, and I think it's really important to get used to that structure and used to providing warrants. In conclusion, like I said, this outline is way too detailed. Let's take a look at what it actually looked like when you wrote it in prep. So even though this week you'll probably be writing a very detailed outline in order to get feedback on it, it's important to note that you have to start developing the skill to do this with shorthand. You cannot write incomplete sentences, otherwise you'll never be able to finish an outline in time during your 30 minutes of prep. And you can see here that Anuj has done a great job of condensing all of those long paragraphs that we were just looking at in his outline into very brief shorthand, right? He only has a couple of words for each of the points that just kind of drop some statistics, drop some short cites, and that's what you're looking for. That's the only way to create an outline in the allotted amount of time, and you just need to get used to practicing converting that shorthand in your notes into complete sentences in your head. But you cannot take the time to try to write down every word and then literally memorize every word. It's just not feasible. So hopefully this video helped to give you clarity about how to organize and generate an Extemp outline. As always, if you have questions, feel free to reach out. I'd be more than happy to help.